Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we speak with leading philanthropy scholar Les Lenkowsky about the giving landscape in America and how it may or may not be changing. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, reformers, social entrepreneurs, nonprofit executives, religious leaders, scholars, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. My name is Jeremy Beer. Thank you for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on November 14th, 2022 in autumnal Phoenix, Arizona. And I am very happy to have as our guest my friend, Dr. Les Lenkowsky, Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs and Philanthropic Studies in the Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and Senior Counselor to the Dean of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. Dr. Lenkowsky has had a distinguished career. He served as Chief Executive Officer of the Corporation for National and Community Service in the George W. Bush administration from 2001 to 2004. Before joining the administration, Dr. Lenkowsky was Professor of Philanthropic Studies and Public Policy at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. From 1990 to 1997, he served as President of the Hudson Institute, which many of you will be familiar with, an internationally renowned public policy research think tank. He also served as president of the Institute for Educational Affairs, deputy director of the United States Information Agency, research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and research director at the Smith Richardson Foundation. Dr. Lenkowsky's writing has appeared in such publications as Commentary, The Weekly Standard, The Wall Street Journal, and The Chronicle of Philanthropy. You'll find him a lot in those places. Still today, Les Lenkowsky, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Great to be here.
It takes a while to introduce you. You've done many things.
So the bio says.
I know it's true. We're going to talk about the meat of our conversation. I expect will be around sort of getting your perspective on American philanthropy today, broadly speaking, and I'll have some specific questions for you. But I thought we'd start out sort of with your background and talking a little bit about your experience with a couple of the institutions that I mentioned before. Listeners to this podcast will have heard the name of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy a number of times. Could you talk about what the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy is and what your role has been within that very important school?
The Lilly Family School of Philanthropy grew out of the Center on Philanthropy, which was created in the 1980s. At a time, a number of universities were looking at creating programs in philanthropy or nonprofit management. Yale had one going, though it didn't last. The Lilly School program was really the first successful one in the sense that it has stayed ever since the late 80s, early 90s, and has now become a school within Indiana University and may still be the only school focused on philanthropy in the United States, if not the world.
And what was your role in the creation of the school?
I actually had almost no role in the creation of the school, but a friend of mine from New York, Robert Payton, who was head of the Exxon Education Foundation when I was director of research of the Smith Richardson Foundation, was the founding director of the Center on Philanthropy. And I moved to Indianapolis just at about the same time he moved. I came to become president of the Hudson Institute, which was then located in Indianapolis. Bob was working on creating the center, and he engaged me from time to time in working with students and participating in activities of the Center on Philanthropy. In 1997, I decided the time had come to move away from the Hudson Institute and to go to look for a job in a university, which after all is why I had gone for a PhD at Harvard right after undergraduate school. And lo and behold, the Center on Philanthropy was interested in adding me to its faculty. When I first moved to Indianapolis for the Hudson Institute, a dear friend of mine in New York counseled me that one should never move to Indianapolis because if the job didn't work out, there would be nothing else for you to do. But surprisingly, when I was ready to move on from Hudson Institute, best place in the world for me was right there in Indianapolis.
Yeah, that is kind of amazing. And the school has become, it's the sort of the flagship school or center for the academic study of philanthropy. What do you think has been, you've watched all this happen. You've been involved with the school for a long time now, 25 years or so. How would you characterize what's happened in the academic study of philanthropy in that last quarter century, and what goods have come out of that movement?
That's a great question, Jeremy. First of all, the study of philanthropy has exploded. So there are probably several hundred universities in the United States, colleges and universities in the United States alone that have one or another type of program in philanthropy or nonprofit management, and then many more programs internationally. So there's a lot more study of philanthropy today in higher education than there used to be. The question is, so what? I have no doubt that our understanding of philanthropy has improved as a result of the research that has gone on in this world. I also think that a number of very good young people have received education in philanthropy and nonprofit management that they've put to good use in their careers. On the other hand, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, as with any enterprise in higher education, not just now, but forever really, it brings with it some of the preoccupations of scholars and universities and some of the biases, not least of which is, in my opinion, too much of a focus on scholarship and the academic side of philanthropy, and not so much on what people who are engaged as practitioners in nonprofit organizations or in foundations actually do. I was and am still one of the few people affiliated with the School of Philanthropy who had an extensive career in the nonprofit sector and in a government agency that had a lot to do with the nonprofit sector. In fact, my first title when I went to IU in 1997 was public intellectual. It was right there in my contract. But I think increasingly, as the study of philanthropy has taken root in universities, it's acquired more of the characteristics of higher education and gotten a bit distant from the world of philanthropic practice.
Yeah, I meet alumni of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in my work, and I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of the faculty members, a few of the faculty members, all very impressive and actually really great people. But that is a concern I have too. Like, is there a chance that the academic study of philanthropy ends up sort of seeping into the practice of philanthropy in a way that sort of limits or mitigates, or what should I say, changes the character of American philanthropy, which has been so successful and such a unique part of the American tradition?
I tend to doubt that. Fortunately, our students who go on to careers in philanthropy are smart enough to know what parts of their educations they should accept and what parts they can quickly forget. And it's also true within philanthropic studies and nonprofit management. There's a recognition of this gap between the scholar and the practitioner. The School of Philanthropy, for example, is launching its second doctoral program this year, a doctorate of philanthropy aimed at practitioners. We created a PhD program in the first decade of this century, and in fact, I was the first director, but it was very much a scholars program rooted in scholarly research and coursework. The new Doctor of Philanthropy will aim a lot more at practice. It will be completely online, and rather than a traditional research dissertation, it will involve a concluding project rooted in the practice of philanthropy. So this is one sign, and there are others, that the world of philanthropic studies also is aware that a gap between scholarship and practitioners is not desirable.
And so another institution, speaking of things that can be used for both good or bad, you were involved with you were the head of the Corporation for National and Community Service. I've heard you talk about this experience before in the past. Talk about what was that in 2001 to 2004 when you were there? What did you learn about the charitable sector through that experience?
Well, the Corporation for National and Community Service is an effort to answer the question, how can government, and particularly the federal government, provide help to the nonprofit sector without co-opting it? We've just had a guest at Indiana University who's one of the leading experts on the work of Alexis de Tocqueville. And of course, Tocqueville famously saw that civic associations were a key component of democratic life in the United States. Much more recently, a number of people have talked about the importance of what they called mediating structures or institutions, more commonly nonprofit groups, as playing a critical role in sustaining democracy in the United States. Robert Nisbet, the famous sociologist, talked about this. We've understood that as government has grown, it has taken over a lot of the activities that nonprofits used to perform. So the question that the Corporation for National Community Service tried to answer is there a way by which government, rather than taking over and displacing civic associations, could actually provide useful support to them? And that question began in modern terms with President George H.W. Bush's talk about the points of light, and his son, President George W. Bush, talking about the armies of compassion. And what the corporation tries to do is identify practical ways by which the armies of compassion can be armed, you might say.
How successful do you think, not only just during your tenure, but since, has it been in walking that line between?
Well, for all the usual political reasons, the success has been mixed. There's no question that there are lots of people who have given a year or two of their time in what we call national service. The number exceeds 1 million now. And they have worked in a number of groups we all admire. Teach for America, for example, got its start through AmeriCorps. City Year, Public Allies, lots of other good groups. Habitat for Humanity received a lot of support through AmeriCorps. So there's no question in my mind, useful things have been accomplished. On the other hand, it's also the case that the state of the nonprofit sector in the United States, and in particular, the state of what one might call civic participation, continues to be fragile. So the corporation and its signature program, AmeriCorps, maybe it prevented things from getting worse, but it certainly has not given that fresh blood into civic associations I, for one, had hoped for.
Well, as you point out, I mean, the headwinds are considerable. All the data about civic participation and civic association in Tocquevillian terms, all the needles are pointing in the wrong direction and have been since the 1960s, basically. I think Robert Putnam has shown us that, and then every data point I can find since Putnam published Bowling Alone, everything just keeps basically getting worse, especially when you get beyond sort of the college-educated upper middle class. With that in mind, I know you follow this very closely. Think about the giving side of the equation. Where do you see giving in the United States going? What are some trends people ought to be paying attention to, or numbers, things that have caught your eye that you're watching closely these days?
Well, the big number is Americans continue to give more and more each year. In fact, the School of Philanthropy does the research for Giving USA, and the report we released last June, I believe the year before might have been the second highest level of giving on record. It's approaching in total $500 billion in giving. So that's quite impressive by any measure, and certainly by international measures. As a percentage of gross domestic product, however, national wealth, you might say, giving's been relatively flat, 2.1% for quite a long time. In addition, we are seeing that the share of giving from middle and lower income people has been declining, and the share from wealthy and very wealthy people has been growing. A smaller percentage of households, by our estimates, report giving in a particular year. That is a worrisome sign. It means basically that giving of money is not as widespread as it used to be. Now, what's important, not to get too gloomy here. Again, the amount of money's gone up. Secondly, we're asking giving of money, but philanthropy, as we've defined it, is the giving of time and money. And time is not always through formal volunteering, but all sorts of informal activities as well. And my guess is a lot of people who are of middle or lower middle income, maybe even low income, participate in giving time as well. So the picture is complicated. I'm not one of those who thinks that the American tradition of philanthropy is ebbing. On the other hand, as we have always known, in fact, we need to pay attention to sustaining philanthropy, healthy philanthropy, just as we would the health of any other set of institutions.
I'm glad to hear that you're not gloomy when I hear those numbers, and I've been following this largely through your own commentary over the last few years. They do concern me, especially about the smaller. I mean, the money going up is great. As you say, it's staying flat as a proportion of, or in terms of ratio with GDP, but a smaller percentage of households giving. I wonder if that reflects my own hypothesis there would be that it reflects the rise of the religiously unaffiliated, the rise in the proportion of households or people who are religiously unaffiliated, since we know that the religiously affiliated, especially the religiously active, give far, far more, according to the Lilly Family School's own data, than do the non-religious. Do you think that's maybe what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's a very important fact. When I first started regularly reading the Giving USA numbers, about half of all gifts made in a particular year went to religious activities of one sort or another, congregations, but also going to secular social services as well. Today, that figure is below 40%. Now, what's interesting is the amount of money going to religion continues to be quite high, but it's a smaller share of total giving. We also know through other surveys that people are reporting they don't attend religious churches and other religious institutions as regularly and so on. So I think that has been a factor, although again, people may not be formally affiliated with religious institutions, but still feel strongly spiritually in one way or another.
Is there state level data on this, Les, in terms of what the proportion of giving is related to GDP in Arizona or Indiana is? Do we have that level of granularity?
I don't know how rigorous that is. I think one of the things we know is that there's still a healthy civic life in the state of Utah. That probably has a lot to do with the Church of Latter-day Saints and its influence in that particular state. that's another factor I think that has affected changes in giving. We're a much more diverse population these days. And so people in our population come from different traditions of giving. For example, historically, a lot of the giving in Latin America was directed at religious causes, particularly Catholic organizations. We have, obviously, and you know this in Arizona, a lot more Latin Americans in the population. One of the interesting questions is, as people come here and stay here and become part of the fabric of our country, does that affect their giving patterns? That was certainly the case for the immigrants who came here in the 19th and early 20th century. And we think it is the case. I certainly have noticed a lot more prominent Latin Americans engaged in philanthropy than there were, say, a quarter century ago. Asian Americans as well. Black Americans are very interesting, since historically their giving has been centered around churches. In fact, I asked a colleague of mine, an African American scholar, who explained to me that the reason the reported rate of volunteering among African Americans was lower than for any other group in the population was a lot of African Americans volunteered at their churches and didn't consider that volunteering. They thought it was a religious duty.
Maybe it is. That's great. Well, we'll be right back. We'll go to a break here. We'll be back and talk more with Les Lenkowsky from Indiana University. Then we'll talk about foundations and some proposals for reform that are bubbling up. We'll be right back. As the education sector in the United States continues to evolve rapidly, some questions about the future of private Christian colleges and universities are in order. How will these institutions survive? How should they respond to the changing educational climate? And will they continue to serve the purpose of educating the whole person, both academically and spiritually? On this November 28th webinar, John Hanna, Director of the Center for Civil Society, will be joined by Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine University School of Public Policy, and David Beer, Director of the Center for Christian Faith and Culture at Malone University, for a frank and illuminating discussion of these questions. Register for the webinar at centerforcivilsociety.org/events. And if you miss it, you can find all our Givers, Doers, and Thinkers webinars on the Center for Civil Society's YouTube channel, link in podcast description. All right, we are back with Dr. Les Lenkowsky of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, among other affiliations. Les, we'll talk about foundations a little bit, and then we'll get to some of the charitable reforms that have been proposed or still, I guess, technically under consideration, at least one in Congress. Talk first about just politicization of the world of philanthropy and foundations in particular. It does strike me that when I first started this company 14 years ago, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, let's say, would try to play it straight in a way far more than it does now. Maybe it's my own, maybe that's a misinterpretation on my part, but it certainly seems that the world of professional philanthropy and foundations has become more heavily politicized, as has everything, I suppose. What do you think about that?
Well, again, I think this has been going on for quite a long time. Back in the 1970s, people like William E. Simon, David Packard, future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, my own mentor, Irving Kristol, frequently talked about the liberal bias of foundations, and foundations are essentially a different type of grant maker. I call them institutional grant makers. They're organizations set up for the purpose of making grants. And the reason was pretty clear, that the culture of foundations reflected the culture of higher education from which they drew their staffs, from the president through program officers and so on. Clearly, ever since the 70s, although there have been efforts such as the creation of the Philanthropy Roundtable to offset these trends, the pace in foundations, as in higher education, has continued apace. So I think you just have to assume, we always have assumed, that foundations are basically liberal in their outlook. There's another reason as well. Foundations are creatures of the progressive era. The first big foundations begin to develop about around 1910 with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and others. And they were created to promote change. Change is understood by their staff and donors. So the foundation world has always been concerned with progress with a capital P. And while the extent of that concern has grown and shifted, it's not particularly new.
Yeah, only not a change in kind, only a change in degree or direction.
In degree, and what are the concerns? I mean, interestingly, things that might have been thought to be progressive at one point, now not so much, particularly things like color blindness, no longer seen as progressive. Instead, it's finding equity, which usually means taking into account race or ethnicity.
Yeah, the nature of the progressive play or orientation, you might say. Well, let me shift then to another thing that comes up a lot in reform proposals at various levels, state level more than federal, I think, at this point. And that would be efforts to put this in a non-neutral way, efforts to restrict or eliminate donor privacy, to make individual donors disclose, and this could get us into the DAF conversation, although I'm trying to keep that for a little bit later, but to make individual donors disclose to whom they give money. Sometimes it's just among 501c4s, more politically oriented nonprofits. Sometimes it's 501c3s. And the Supreme Court has had a ruling on this, I think, with respect to California. What do you think about this donor privacy question as it stands today? What should people be worried about, if anything?
Well, there's a lot of hand-wringing about it, but actually when you look at what has been going on, donors still have a large degree of privacy. We've long understood, at least since the late 1950s, when the Supreme Court decided a famous case involving the NAACP chapter in Alabama, that to reveal the identities of donors to particular causes might expose them to pressure or even worse. And so for the most part, we continue to safeguard the privacy of donors, though there are lots of people who feel this is a bad idea. I'm currently working on a review of a book that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has just written, in which he excoriates what he calls dark money, namely money aimed at political influence, but where the identities of the donors aren't known. One of the ironies of this is, if in fact the identities weren't known, how could you write a book about it? I mean, clearly the money isn't so dark if we can, the book denounces, as it does, people like the Koch family and others. The other thing is that dark money, so-called, operates all across the political spectrum. They're major donors who conceal their identities as well, but who champion left-of-center causes. So in any case, we continue to, have a lot of debate about this, but as a practical matter, today's laws are not all that different from where they were when the 1969 Tax Act was passed.
And you don't expect that to change? You don't expect...
I do not at all. There is a bill pending now with Congress as people who propose bills, attach names to them that may have very little relationship to what the bill does. So there is a proposal that's been in the current Congress almost since the very beginning of it, nearly 2 years now, called the Accelerating Charitable Effort, or ACE Act, that would try to get more transparency, especially with regard to smaller funds called donor-advised funds. But it is going absolutely nowhere. There have been no hearings in 2 years. It has 3 co-sponsors in the Senate and 3 in the House. That's out of 535 members of Congress. It has attracted a lot of attention within the nonprofit sector, but as a practical matter, there's no sign of it becoming law anytime soon.
Can you talk a little bit more, just for the sake of context and situational awareness for our listeners? What else is in the ACE Act? What are its principal provisions?
The main aim of the ACE Act is to try to regulate what are called donor-advised funds. Donor-advised funds go back a long time to the 1930s, but they've been growing since the 1990s. Essentially, what a donor-advised fund is: an individual or family make a donation to a charitable organization, and it could be a wide variety of such organizations, including some sponsored by investment companies. They get a tax deduction when they make the donation, but retain the right to make decisions about which charities will ultimately get the money they donated and when. Donor-advised funds have grown rapidly, and they've been particularly growing strong in for-profit companies that sponsor charitable organizations. So Fidelity Investments, for example, is now the largest sponsor of donor-advised funds. But you'll also find them in community foundations, in special purpose organizations such as Jewish federations, and so on. So the aim of the ACE Act really is to try and ensure that these funds operate within the kinds of regulations that foundations have had to operate within since the 1969 Tax Act. So, for example, and it's a fairly complicated piece of legislation, rather than making a donation to create a donor-advised fund and then maybe spending only a little of it on actual what are called working charities, the ACE Act would require that the amount be paid out within a certain number of years. These are the kinds of changes. And again, it's fairly complicated, but the point is to try and make sure that money for which tax deduction is taken will go into operating charities as soon as possible.
Yeah, because right now, the way it stands, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I put $10,000, I give, it's a gift, right? I give $10,000 to a donor-advised fund. So I get to take that deduction this year. Then Fidelity, the good folks at Fidelity, whoever's holding that DAF, are waiting for me to advise them on where, out of that fund, how do I want to spend it? $1,000 here, $2,000 here to this charity or that charity. But I don't have to spend any of it out over any particular length of time as it stands now. Is that correct?
That is correct. Although, as it happens, the rates that Fidelity and other sponsors report are quite substantial, much more than the payout rate for grant-making foundations, which is set at 5% of their assets. Typically, out of these donor-advised funds, the rates are much higher, though not all the funds will spend at the average rate. So it's not so clear what the nature of the problem is. There is something, I think, that offends particularly law professors who are behind the ACE Act, with somebody getting a deduction for something, but not necessarily having to make gifts to operating charities right away.
Yeah, I would just say philosophically, you're not the social good isn't coming right away or even within a prescribed amount of time. it's one of those things where it seems to me both sides have a point. So the payout rate from DAFs on average is what, 13% or 15% or something like that?
I think it depends on where you look. It may even be higher. Yeah, I mean, they're both sides can make points. The problem is that DAFs, as they currently exist, have attracted a lot of money into the world of donations. The question, and one of the reasons they have, is precisely because the rules regarding them give families or individuals who set them up a great deal of leeway, including possibly safeguarding their privacy and where they make their gifts. To the extent you start adding rules, they probably become less attractive, which may ultimately result in less money going to charity.
Yes, which is obviously what we don't want. And I think the privacy aspect of DAFs, rather than get rid of that, I would rather just extend it back to foundations. That would be my argument.
Well, there have been some well-publicized examples of people with foundations using money from their foundations to create DAFs. Elon Musk, for example, when he sold shares of Tesla, supposedly, at least according to published reports, put the money first in his foundation, and then the foundation paid the money out to a donor-advised fund to satisfy its payout rate, and then the money sits in the donor-advised fund. This is all, I mean, they're always in the world of philanthropy, scandals of this sort that you could say, oh, this isn't what we mean by being charitable. But by the same token, if we establish rules aimed at well-publicized cases, we may sweep into those rules a lot of people who are just trying to figure out how to give in ways that suit their own particular situations.
Well, let's talk about another thing. I don't know what you'll have to say to me about this today, but I know you have commented before, I believe it was the Trump tax cuts, or tax changes, I should say, there was some gloom and doom about what that was going to do to charitable giving. I remember you published a piece with one of your colleagues saying you didn't think that would be the case, and I think you proved to be right. Are we overly concerned generally about how tax laws and rates affect charitable giving?
Yes, I think we are. This concern goes back a long time. When the standard deduction was first introduced into our tax law during World War II, the organizations representing charities at the time objected to it. They felt if people couldn't deduct the amount they give to charity, it might lessen charitable giving. Well, that didn't happen, of course. Move forward back to into the 1970s, there was a major commission headed by a man named John Filer looking at public policy toward philanthropy. And under the auspices of this commission, the first real serious studies of the effects of tax policy on giving were done. And the principal author was Martin Feldstein, who would go on to become chair of Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. And Feldstein found while there was an effect, the more benefit you get in terms of reducing your taxes, the more likely you would be to give to charity. The benefit was a very small one, much smaller than most people thought it would be. In fact, Feldstein's work, he also was joined in this by another economist, much younger, named Michael Boskin, who went on to chair George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. This was so heretical that the Filer Commission asked a professor at the University of Chicago Business School to go over the findings to see what Feldstein and his associates had gotten wrong, and it turned out they hadn't gotten it wrong, that in fact the effect of taxes on giving was small, not anywhere near as large as the nonprofit world had been arguing for many years.
Well, it's a good thing for, I think, many listeners of this podcast to hear, because we're asked about that a lot. And my usual answer, based on your analysis and having spoken to you in the past, is don't worry about it. So you have bigger things to worry about probably than this.
Yeah, I think my view is that tax policy has very small effect on whether or not to make a gift, might have a much larger effect on things like the timing or the amount of the gift.
So speaking of that, what impact are you thinking about the possibility of a recession and what impact that might have? What if you're a nonprofit leader? I'm asking you, Dr. Lenkowsky, if there's a recession coming, let's say it does hit in 2023, how concerned should I be about my philanthropic revenue?
Well, there's a prior question, I think, that the nonprofit world is currently grappling with. The last time we had inflation at the current rate was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Hardly anyone leading a nonprofit organization or foundation was around then to have to deal the impact of rising prices and wages on the activities of nonprofits. And remember, the single largest expense of most charities are staff expenses. So as wages go up, it creates big pressures on the budget. On the other hand, recessions are not good for charitable giving. We can certainly document that giving goes down during a recessionary period, but nonprofits have lived through a number of recessions. Most recently, of course, the Great Recession of 2008 through 2010, early 2010. They've learned how to deal with it, how to diversify their funds, how to postpone expenditures, and so on. So a recession won't be good for the nonprofit sector, let alone the rest of the economy, but it's not unknown. On the other hand, the consequences of inflation, certainly if it were to persist, would be a world that most people in the nonprofit sector have not had any experience with. Should make one other point. We tend to think that charities get most of their revenues or a large share of their revenues from donations. That's not true. The single largest source of income for most charities is earned income, fees for services. Think of what you pay in tuition or the fee you pay to hospitals, the tickets to the symphony, and so on. The second largest share comes from government, but a big chunk of that, about 2/3 of it, of what government provides, really comes in the form of things like Medicaid or Medicare. In other words, reimbursements for fees paid to nonprofit organizations. Charitable giving, on average, amounts to 10 to 15% of the revenue stream for nonprofit organizations. It's much larger for some of them, like religious organizations, but most of our nonprofits, and certainly the biggest ones, have a very broadly diversified share of revenues, and they will be balancing those if we go into a recession.
All right, let's end. I want to make sure we talk about this for a couple of minutes, and because it shows your own participation in civil society, your own leadership in civil society. Talk about Julius Rosenwald and this idea of maybe having a national park to honor his own philanthropic legacy.
Yeah, there were three great people in the first decades of American philanthropy. Two of them are well known, Rockefeller and Carnegie. But the third, who is very much a peer of the first two, was a man named Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald was the marketing genius behind Sears Roebuck, which was the big department store of in the first part of the 20th century. Rosenwald was also a very generous man. He had gotten to know Booker T. Washington and had supported the Tuskegee Institute. But Mr. Washington said that what they really needed in the Deep South, and again, we're talking about 1900 to 1930, were elementary and secondary schools, especially in rural areas for African Americans. So through his philanthropy, the Rosenwald Fund helped underwrite 5,000 elementary and secondary schools in the Deep South. Communities had to participate as well, so it was a partnership, not just funded by Rosenwald himself. This was one of the greatest examples of American philanthropy in our history, and it is also not as well known. So a few years ago, a group of us came together to propose to create a national historic site in honor of Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. There has never been a historic site in honor of a philanthropist in American history, and the Rosenwald schools themselves, of which about 36 are still existing, played a key role in the civil rights movement, among other things. For example, the school from which the students came to go to Central High School in Little Rock was a Rosenwald Junior High School. In December of 2020, Congress took the first step to create this park by passing a bill directing the National Park Service to do a feasibility study. The park itself is to consist of a museum in Chicago, which was Rosenwald's business locale, plus the Park Service will take over, upgrade, and make available to the public 6 of the still existing Rosenwald schools. The feasibility study is still underway. It's probably got another year or so to run, and at that point, a recommendation will be made and forwarded to the Department of Interior and ultimately to the Congress about whether or not we should recognize an American philanthropist who did so much, particularly in the area of civil rights, in our national park and historic site system.
Very cool. It's a great idea. I'm surprised no one had it before, but I hope it comes to fruition. That'd be great to see.
Thanks. We're hoping to.
We shall see, and it's out of our hands. Les Lenkowsky, thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
You can find out more about the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. If you're interested, just go to philanthropy.iupui.edu. There are many resources there for givers and nonprofit leaders. I encourage you to check it out. And you can find more about Les and his work there as well. And thanks very much again, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe and/or rate and review this discussion on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. And have a guest you'd like to hear from? Send your request to our producer, Katie Janis, at kjanis@amphil.com. That's KJANUS@amphil.com.